This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. This week, I'm speaking to one of America's most exciting and lauded writers, Colson Whitehead. He's the winner of 2 Pulitzer Prizes for fiction, joining a club composed of only, and this is for all you trivia enthusiasts out there, William Faulkner, John Updike, and Booth Tarkington. Whitehead's Pulitzers were for the historical novels The Underground Railroad and The Nickel Boys. He's back with Crook Manifesto, a sequel to his novel Harlem Shuffle. That book was set in 1960s Harlem, and this one takes place about a decade later. Both star Ray Carney, a furniture salesman whose father was a low-level criminal. Ray is the first in his family to go to college. He makes a proper life for himself, and yet there's something in him that can't keep him away from the criminal element. As Whitehead writes in his first novel, Carney was only slightly bent when it came to being crooked in practice and ambition. On this week's episode, I speak to Whitehead about crime novels, New York in the 1970s, and how he comes up with all those wacky crook names. I am here with Colson Whitehead, author of the new novel Crook Manifesto. Colson, welcome.
How'd you do?
So it drives me nuts when an interview opens with the question, so why did you decide to write this book? It feels like a cheap question, but I sort of had to ask something equally stiff, which is, tell us what Crook Manifesto is about.
Crook Manifesto is the second book in what I guess I call the Harlem trilogy. I haven't come up with a better name. So following a man named Ray Carney, who has a furniture store in Harlem during the daytime, and at night he's a fence. He takes stolen goods and helps them be recirculated into polite society. He's a divided nature, and over the course of the first book, Harlem Shuffle, and then this book, Crook Manifesto, he's wrestling with his psychology, embracing, rejecting his criminal side, and trying to be a good family man.
So you've said this is part of a trilogy. The first one is Harlem in the 60s. This is Harlem in the 70s. Presumably you're writing one that will be set in Harlem in the 80s. When did you know that would be the case? Was it the setting, or was it the character, Ray Carney, that felt like it could carry the load of 3 books?
It seemed like a natural progression. Originally, Harlem Shuffle was going to be one heist, but I kept coming up with jobs and capers, so it became 3 different criminal jobs. And halfway through writing it, I was coming up with more. That was too much for a book. So that became 2 books. And then if you do 2, you might as well do 3. You know, it's the rule of 3, a trilogy. I grew up on Star Wars. It makes sense to me. Jumping in 3 different decades, I get to have the panorama of New York City and then also of this man's life.
You could have fought the trilogy impulse. You could be like, everything's a trilogy. I'm just going to break it at 2.
I was halfway through Crook Manifesto when Harlem Shuffle came out. So it would have been very embarrassing if everyone hated Harlem Shuffle, and here I am with, here's my sequel to the book no one liked. Also, I did not say publicly, I didn't murmur privately, that it was a trilogy in case I got bored. George R.R. Martin, everyone's like nagging him all the time. So I didn't want my obituary to say, and he never finished that trilogy he announced. So I better not announce it unless I'm going to commit.
When you are working on conceptualizing, writing, diagramming, sketching capers, and there are several over these 2 books, what does that look like? Like, how are you plotting these out?
Oh, it's another heist? ? Are there too many heists in this book? In the Harlem Shuffle, there is a night of madness. A corrupt cop takes Carney on a series of adventures across a terrible night in Harlem. In the second story, someone goes missing, and Pepper, an old criminal, ends up being a sort of grumpy private investigator. So staying within the genre and maybe not having every story be a robbery, but a different way of examining Carney's world and how he reacts to different situations.
Now, the crime novel as a genre has a sort of a wonderful tradition of, here's the next entry in the adventures of this private eye or this law enforcement officer. You have your Marlowes and your Sam Spades. You have your Lou Archers, Travis McGee, Easy Rawlings, not to mention more modern characters. But Ray Carney is just a successful furniture store owner who has this side gig at night. How do you see him fitting into that sort of larger tradition?
Well, I mean, I've read some crime books. I'm not like a super expert, but I like the heist genre, and to me, it's mostly a film genre. But when I started, I was like, okay, I should really bone up on other things in this style. And I quickly realized that I didn't care about all the people you just named, the cops and the PIs. It wasn't about law enforcement. It was about criminals and deviants. And so my shining star was Richard Stark. It was a book, 20-something novels about a very flat affect, semi-sociopathic criminal named Parker, who's really good at what he does, but is always foiled because he has to rely on other people, and other people always let him down. That was appealing to me, that the kind of aberrant psychology. What are these people like who are heisters for a living? Not so much not so much hired killers, but people who rob things and how they function in society. So having a hero who has one foot in the upstanding world and one foot in darkness was my way into the genre.
The reception to your previous book, Harlem Shuffle, was an interesting one, I thought, because it seems to have matched your desire to move into a different mode, right? So you've spoken about this. You had written these two beautiful books, The Underground Railroad and The Nickel Boys. They were acclaimed, but they were heavy. And then you followed that up by zagging into this colorful, funny, lively, thrilling heist novel. How do you arrive at the place where you are ready to move into that new mode? Because you do skip around a lot.
I'm generally sick of whatever I just finished. My first book, The Intuitionist, has a main character, Lila Mae Watson, who's very controlled and very repressed. The plot is very linear. It takes after detective novels, so I've been playing with the genre since the beginning. And so John Henry Day's my second novel is more expansive in that kind of encyclopedic American mode with a lot of different characters. There's more jokes. And I get to use these different muscles. It's rare for me to do like two heavy, serious books back to back, but The Nickel Boys just seemed like the best follow-up for me intellectually after The Underground Railroad. So it was a real relief to be able to tell jokes again and have fun with conventions in a way, have a sense of play, which due to the subject matter of The Nickel Boys and Underground Railroad, I couldn't do before for a while.
One of the things that you have to do by necessity in your new book, Crook Manifesto, is have little recaps of what happened to the characters in the last book, in case I imagine someone happens to be picking up this one without reading the last one, or if they just forgot what happened in the last book. I always see that in serious novels, certainly. How do you do that without being artless?
It's hard. I mean, no, I am trying to think of the person who's starting with this book. I'm trying not to bore the person who read Harlem Shuffle 2 years ago or longer, years from now. And maybe you've forgotten some of the plot details. And so I want to refresh your memory. So it is very difficult. And, you just try to find the right balance. I remember renting Lawrence of Arabia on 2 like VHS cassettes when that was the thing. And I put it in, I was watching it. And then the credits started rolling. I was like, what? Because I put them out of order. And I was like, this movie really starts in media res. On the one hand, I like those difficult Pinch-y, Delillo-y novels where the reader has to find their way. But in something like this, I want to do a little more hand-holding.
There comes a point in the book where I had to do the Leonardo DiCaprio pointing at the television meme in real time because someone says the title of the book. I'm going to read it here. A man has a hierarchy of crime, of what is morally acceptable and what is not, a Crook Manifesto, and those who subscribe to lesser codes are cockroaches. Now, this is a very particular character saying this, a character of Pepper, who's amazing and taciturn and violent, but also has discovered sort of an openness in his life as he meets the main character that maybe he didn't have before.
Yeah.
But he still, at his core, has this manifesto. Whoa. Talk to me a little bit about that character.
So he's Pepper, and hopefully there are echoes of Parker in him. I wanted someone who's really good at his job, seemingly broke because he has to work with losers all the time, and has a code. There are many criminals in the book, many types of criminals. There are murderers, there are robbers, blackmailers, pimps. And I guess they each have codes, and definitely Pepper has a code of things he will not do. He won't judge Ray Carney's father for being an arsonist, but he would never throw a firebomb into a tenement where there are people inside. And on the scale of crimes, how bad is Carney? How bad is Pepper when there are all these other worse people around? And your own Crook Manifesto, I think, becomes your morality, what you will and will not do. And on Judgment Day, you'll have to have some sort of accounting, and your manifesto is what's going to keep you from those who are really going to burn.
Speaking of burning, Fire is all over this book. It was a little bit in the last book because, as you say, the main character, Ray Carney, his dad was a part-time arsonist. In this book, however, you have at the core of the second story, certainly a character named Zippo who directs a blaxploitation film, partly in Ray Carney's furniture store, but he also has a part of him that's secret to everyone else, which is he likes to watch things go up in flames.
The three different capers are linked, and they're building to the third act, the third story. And the theme of fire and different manifestations is seeded through the first two sections. The 1970s were a time of great fires in Harlem, in the Bronx. Buildings were going up because of squatters. Empty buildings were catching flame. Some people were cashing in insurance money and torching buildings. And the whole blocks were devastated, and a big plot in the third section. And different people and different kinds of fires are in the first and second section. Zippo was a minor character in Harlem Shuffle. I was planning the second book and trying to figure out who would come back. And so his love of fire, that's how he got his name, Zippo, made him a natural addition. What does Zippo get out of it as opposed to the psychopathic arsonist versus the insurance people? And so the same way that I'm showing different aspects of New York and different aspects of Ray, the idea of fire is being explored through these different members of the supporting cast.
I love Zippo as a character. And again, if you haven't read the book yet, I know you will, but also we're not really spoiling anything here. He is a firebug. He's a movie director, but he also considers himself
he's multi-talented, yes,
in both these ways to be an artist of sorts, right? He says that was art, manifesting your idea in the world. He later says with art, it wasn't enough to conceive of it. You had to make it. And he could be talking about making a movie, but he's talking about lighting fires.
He's had some therapy for his fire inclinations, and so he has this rationalization about visualizing something versus executing it. But if you're an artist, you can't just think about it and visualize it. You have to bring it into the world. And so he's wrestling with that.
How many ideas have you had that you've written down in notebooks and have not been visualized yet? I imagine these ideas came to you years ago.
Not that many, actually. If I remember them, it's because they are viable and I stuck with them. I thought the origin story for the Carney stories was 2014, the summer, trying to figure out what I wanted to rent. Ocean's 11 heists. Does that be fun? And then I found a notebook from 2012, and there's one entry, and it just says fence. And I have no recollection of why I wrote it down, but obviously it wasn't like a fence or a wall. It was like a criminal fence. Even though I don't remember being enamored with that kind of character, it goes back. And so, for me, definitely, if an idea stays with me, and every couple of years I think about it, should I do this or that? And then it becomes like a habit and part of my life. And when I have my schedule clear, I'll probably pick it up.
Have you ever seen the movie The Hot Rock?
I saw it as a kid, and then last summer, I finally saw it as a grown-up. And I started the book, but couldn't get through the book.
So it's a movie starring Robert Redford. It's directed by Peter Yates, who directed Bullet, I believe.
Yes. And George Siegel's in it. I was a big George Siegel fan.
George Siegel's in it. It's based on a Donald Westlake novel, and it is a heist movie that takes place in late 60s, early 70s New York. And it opens with a great bungled heist at the Brooklyn Museum.
Yeah, it was great. It was great to see, having lived in Brooklyn for a long time, and I'm always looking in the background, comparing my New York to the movie New York. So it was great fun to see it.
I mean, the fun in that movie, which is touched on a little in these books, is the realization that a heist can go wrong at any point. And there's also fun in seeing it go wrong.
There is the pleasure of the super geniuses, the Ocean's 11 type people who are experts at their craft. And then I have a real affection for the sweaty losers who are toiling. They're drilling in the safe for all night before the bank opens in the morning, trying to get it done, and things are going wrong. And they've plotted and planned for so long, and it's the night, the final night is finally here, and everything just goes wrong. I love both potentials in a heist. They pull it off, and you're rooting for them, or they don't, and they have your sympathy.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz. Luckily, I'm not alone. I'm joined here by Colson Whitehead, author of the new novel, Crook Manifesto. Colson, talk to me about Harlem in the 70s and how it felt different to write than Harlem in the 60s.
The last section of the book takes place in 76, and I was living in Harlem at the time. But I don't remember that much because I was very young. So I'm recreating it the same way I was recreating Harlem in the 60s in the first book. But I do remember that sense of danger. People always talking about crime. I remember the dirt and dinginess, just the graffiti, being on the one train, comes out of the tunnel and is elevated for a while. And my brother and I would go to the front window and look out and see us come out of the tunnel. And the window was so dirty and our noses were pressed up against this grimy glass. So that grime is in the book. The city was in a fiscal crisis, was bankrupt. Crime was at an all-time high. It's much more desperate than, say, the 1964 section of Harlem Shuffle, which took place during the World's Fair in a time of jet age optimism. We have JFK, we have New Camelot. So it's very different, and the crimes are different, the atmosphere is different. Ray Carney is going through his changes, and so is the city.
I feel like when people talk about New York City in the 70s, they talk about the Bronx is burning. They talk about CBGBs. And then there's this whole gap in between. And I feel like Harlem in the 70s is an image that has been impressed in people's minds because of film, because of blaxploitation, because of movies like Across 110th Street, which are actually shown downtown this week.
No, very good.
As part of a Yaphet Kotto mini retrospective, or Cotton Comes to Harlem or stuff like that. Do you think that readers will have a firmer image of Harlem and New York in the 70s in their minds because of all of those outside influences?
It's hard for me to think of how an outsider or someone who's younger thinks that time period. I was talking about Harlem Shuffle abroad, and a French blogger, writer, was very confused because she came to New York and it was nothing like Law and Order. So I guess she didn't stumble upon a dead body within the first 5 minutes of stepping off the plane. I'm not sure what kind of images people have of the place, particularly in the 70s. I think I'm a very visual writer, and I am trying to recreate it for myself and my characters, and hopefully people can find their way in from the way I'm describing it.
You have spoken, I think you actually spoke in this podcast last time you were here, about all the research that went into Harlem Shuffle. I imagine you had to do more historical research. The first part of Crook Manifesto deals with a crooked cop who was involved with the Knapp Commission, which was a investigative body that was put together to try to root out bad cops after Serpico, the guy from the Al Pacino movie, sort of mess it all up for all of these crooked cops. How interesting was it to go back in the archives and look back at all this stuff?
I was raised by TV and afternoon matinees on Channel 9, Channel 11 in New York City. So I remember seeing Serpico, I was in junior high. I remember seeing Dog Day Afternoon. And definitely I feel like the first section is a very Sidney Lumet, New York City. And so I know the story of Serpico, not because I was around, but because of the movie. So going to the nonfiction book that Serpico was based on by Peter Moss, going to the Knapp Commission report, which is basically a map to corruption. They break down exactly how the cops were doing all their shenanigans, and that's in the book. It's a manual of corruption and future corruption, I assume. So all those primary sources have been great for this book and the first one. Because the characters were established in the world, I did less homework on New York City history and Harlem history. And once I picked 1971 and 73 and 76 as the three sites for the stories, it was more trying to figure out what was going on those different years that I could use for Carney.
1976 is the year in which the last segment of the book takes place. It's bicentennial year, pretty big to do here in New York, tons of ships in the harbor back then. Do you remember 1976? Do you remember any of that stuff?
No, I remember red, white, and blue everywhere for like 6 months. I was very young. I didn't see there was a great flotilla of ships that came into New York Harbor. I don't remember that at all. I remember George Washington being used in a lot of advertising, and that's part of the book. How the holiday, the commemoration, is corrupted by advertisement and baser instincts.
How does Ray Carney, or how do Ray Carney and Pepper see the bicentennial? They are men who live in Harlem. They're black men who are surrounded by people telling them, this country's great. Let's celebrate it. And several times they're like, well, I don't know about that.
One of my favorite traditions is waiting for someone to post on social media on July 4th, Frederick Douglass's What is July 4th to a Slave? We have these ideas about America and these ideals that we don't live up to. So what is the bicentennial when you're not free, when you only got the vote 12 years ago? Carney wrestles with that. And then Pepper, he's sort of above it all or under it all. And, speaking of that flotilla of ships, he just says, I don't care about some candy-ass ships. Like, what does it mean? What does it mean to have this parade in the Hudson? It's completely meaningless.
The middle section of your book involves the filming of a blaxploitation film, Secret Agent Nefertiti. As someone who clearly is a film fan, what is your experience with that particular genre?
As a kid, watching them on, again, Friday afternoon.
WPIX.
There weren't a lot of movies starring black people with black stories, even grotesque exploitation stories. And so whenever something was on, whether it was Across 110th Street or Blackula or the sequel Scream, Blackula Scream, my brother and I, and also my parents, we were a horror-loving family. And then when I became a pop culture critic, I was writing about black imagery in 90s TV and film, and I would bring up blaxploitation a lot as like a touchstone and how things have changed and not changed. And in this case, I went back to see which ones could serve the story, and they don't really hold up for me now unless generous to exploitation fare and flaws. Basically, I had to attack them not as a fan, but someone who's trying to figure out how to use them for the work. I'm a person, a novelist, writing about made-up crimes, and then in my book, made-up characters are in a made-up movie about crimes, and then something happens. So there's all these different layers of artifice. I think that's really interesting. And then I do get to salute some of my early influences. The plot of the film is not a big part of that section, but it is in the background, and I get to have fun with the black super spies of that era.
One of the things I love about these two books, to be honest, maybe it's a small thing, maybe it's not too, but it's the names. Momo, Mike Yella, T-Bone Givens. Put Lewis. There's a guy in the first book named Lancelot St. John. You put a bunch of stuff in a hat, then you pick two out. You're like, here we go. Lancelot St. John.
It varies. I have a file on my phone where it's like Gibbons. Yeah, Gibbons could be a character at some point. If I'm stuck, I can always go to Wikipedia's page of 1950s Negro baseball stars. I want old-timey names. In terms of the real criminal nicknames, whenever I read about some gang being rousted in the news, I see that my creations are nothing to actually what the real guys actually call themselves, which is so nonsensical I can't put them in the book.
One thing that recurs in these books, at least to me, is the way that you use the city and some of its features as metaphors, right? So in Harlem Shuffle, you write, everyone had secret corners and alleys that no one saw. What mattered were your major streets and boulevards, the stuff that showed up in other people's maps of you. And in your new book, Crook Manifesto, you use the street game Ringo Levio, which is sort of a supersized version of tag, to represent the fuzzy line between law enforcement and criminality, between cops and robbers. This is a very precise question, or like super detailed question, but at one point in conceiving a story, does your mind flare up with those connections where you're like, okay, these subway stations that no longer exist can also represent this thing about this character?
Yeah, the 91st Street GO station on the number 1 train makes an appearance, and my whole life I've been taking that train, and I always look out and see like this walled up station that we pass through, and it's covered with graffiti. It's dark in between 96 and 86. And so that's a personal obsession, which I can, after decades of thinking about this place, put into the book. Ringo Levio, I played as a kid as a game of tag on steroids, kind of cops and robbers, and came across a reference to it. Hadn't thought about it in decades. But yeah, you're playing cops and robbers, and what does that mean when you're a black kid? And what does it mean when you're a corrupt cop? And so Munson, a corrupt cop, and Carney have these different associations with cops and robbers in this tag, and especially now that they're grown up and engage in a more serious version of cops and robbers. What does it mean? Some things I'm filing away and hope to use one day before I kick the bucket. And then sometimes I'll come across something by accident and I get that spark like, oh yeah, Ringo Livio.
I want to walk down a side alley and ask you about a bit of writing that I think, at least for New Yorkers, is one of your most beloved, right? So this was a piece that was published a month after the attacks of September 11th in the New York Times Magazine and was later collected in a book of yours, The Colossus of New York. I urge our listeners, by the way, to check this piece out if you haven't. New Yorkers are very prideful about being from New York, but your piece is incredibly open-armed. You wrote it, again, a month after 9/11, and you basically say that anyone can be a New Yorker. It's like at the end of Into the Spider-Verse when Miles Morales says, anyone can wear the mask, right? Anyone can be a New Yorker. And specifically, you write, no matter how long you've been here, you are a New Yorker the first time you say, that used to be the TikTok lounge. You're a New Yorker when what was there before is more real and solid than what is here now. I think this relates to these two books, but I'm just wondering if you can reflect on that piece and how you look upon it more than 2 decades later.
It was very important to me, trying to make sense of my hometown after it had been attacked. There was that concert for New York, and I was writing it, and David Bowie was talking about how much he loved New York and all these great artists who I adore. And I was sort of weeping writing this essay. And then the response was, I felt better writing it, and I was articulating so much about the city I'd never tried to articulate before. And then when it came out, it meant so much to other people. I'd never written something that had that kind of response. It moved me to write more essays about the city. And then in my fiction, there are bits of that piece that show up, and I'm analyzing different sentences from that essay and using them dramatically in fiction 2 decades later. So it was very important to me as a person and as an artist. And I'm really grateful that it's still meaningful to people. And on 9/11, people traded on social media and talk about how much it meant to them. And I'm really grateful that it's still a living document and so meaningful to people.
I bring it up in the context of these two books because the passing of time in these books and between the books is often conveyed through the very thing I just mentioned there, the absence of a physical place that used to be there. I was recently walking around New York and saying, that what happened to this place? And, oh, don't you remember? Blah. And that is just a thing that anyone who has been here for a certain amount of time does. And it's a thing that Ray Carney does.
Yeah, and me too. I'm a great bore. Always telling my kids, I used to live there. I was like, yes, we got the first 100 times we passed this moronic corner. The city's always changing, and then also it's always changing, and it's also our essential city. The 125th Street of Harlem Shuffle is gone because it's now Nike stores and Shake Shack and Gap and Magic Johnson theaters. But if you go 2 blocks up, there's a row of brownstones that's been there for 150 years. And the original white settlers of Harlem live there. And then the black transplants from the South moved there in the 20s. And now the great-grandkids of the white immigrants who first lived there and then moved on as they became middle class are coming to a gentrified Harlem, and these great-grandkids are doing the same dance. And soon these transplants will be saying, oh, that Shake Shack used to be a Shake Shack. And now it's a weed store. You know.
Colson, thank you so much for coming once again onto the Book Review Podcast to talk about your new book.
My pleasure.
That was my conversation with Colson Whitehead, author of the new novel Crook Manifesto. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thank you for listening.